gather today from across Grey Bruce counties to learn about and shine the light on cooperative solutions. It's important to acknowledge that we're on the territory of Indigenous peoples. Specifically, this is the territory of the Anishinaabe Nation, the people of the Three Fires, Odawa, Potawatomi, and Ojibwe, who gathered and governed here since time immemorial, and who are represented today by the Saugeen Ojibwe Nation, consisting of the communities of Saugeen First Nation and the Chippewa of Nawash Unceded First Nation at Niashigaming. We also recognize these lands as lands of the Métis Nation of Ontario. Gathering on these lands, we are all treaty people with all the relations and responsibilities that entails. Tonight, each of us can reflect on how we participate in collaborative solutions by learning about them tonight from some of our speakers, which is great, who are joining us. And we should be, through these engagements in collaborative solutions, reflecting and respecting the responsibilities and relations that we have with our Indigenous founders on these lands. Good to be here. I'm also a Georgian Bluffs resident and co-host along with Leigh and Joachim, so enjoy the evening.
Thanks very much, Jenny. So welcome everybody here. We have a really exciting evening today. We have Kristine Hammell and Kelsey Carriere. She couldn't come by on her own today, so we taped it earlier and recorded it. And so you will get the recording that she will talk about Glassworks. But Tanya, who also works for Glassworks, she will be here and you can ask her questions. And then we have Thorsten Arnold, who also works with Kristine, who is his partner at Persephone Market Gardens.
Yeah, about a year ago, we changed Cat Grey Bruce into Climate Forum. And now we're bringing local perspectives to big climate issues, as opposed to all the national and global actions of climate actions that you can get lost in. So we focus local here, and we kind of think that Climate Forum helps us tie climate issues to our own priorities too. Instead of going around telling everyone they have to make climate action a bigger priority, we're examining ways that we can address climate in our everyday actions. So welcome, like Joachim and Jenny said, thanks for joining. And our co-hosting job, we are your co-hosts, the three of us. It's not only just to host the conversation, we also make sure that your question doesn't get lost, and we're learning about the solutions ourselves. So you are free to relax and chime in the chat box that Jenny and Joachim are monitoring. Joachim, you want to introduce our first panelist, Kristine?
Many know her. She was on the Climate Forum before. Today, she will talk about the Bruce Grey Outdoor School, which is a not-for-profit cooperative seeking to offer quality farm and land-based programming for children and youth that is accessible to everyone and complements the regular school system's curriculum with practical, experience-based learning. So they envision an educational community which connects people with land and brings attention to our role as ecosystem caretakers. They aim to foster curiosity, critical thinking, creativity, and connection by giving kids the opportunity to delve into the world around them and themselves. So please welcome Kristine Hammell.
Hello. Thank you very much for having me this evening. I'll just preface myself in that I seem to have a bit of a concussion. So if I seem a little bit spacey today, that's why. Yes, so an outdoor school. Joachim gave a great summary of what we're attempting to do. So I'll focus maybe a little bit on this part about the collaborative approach we're hoping to take with it. And that is really rooted in its basic setup, which at this point is that it's incorporated as a not-for-profit cooperative. And we think that's really key. That structure is really critical because the education of kids, I think, is really something that needs to be shaped and carried by the community as a whole. and that the community needs to be able to adapt it over time and set priorities. And by having a cooperative, that structurally makes that possible and essential, because as a cooperative, it's dependent on the community members contributing to it and helping to create it. And that also is sort of related to the challenges of trying to work within that kind of a collaborative and cooperative approach, is that it really requires getting people together and getting things started. And I think it's those first steps that are most difficult, and especially with this project, that's the challenge we're facing, in that it's a bit of a chicken and an egg problem of getting started. That we need a foundation in place to operate programming, and that foundation involves things like the governance structure of the cooperative, but also then the operating aspects of outdoor education. So things like emergency plans and all those kinds of things, and insurance. And in order to have insurance, you need to have other pieces in place. And so it's a challenge to try and get that chicken or the egg. How do you get it started? And so at this point, we have incorporated, we have a board, and we are trying to continue to put the pieces together so that there is a community approach to outdoor education. And I think maybe linking it back, why is this climate action? I think in the end, climate action requires sort of broad changes in our society, and we need folks, starting with kids, but definitely also the adults, to be really connected with land, both as inspiration and as solace during the hard work of trying to change systems, that we can find inspiration in the land around us, and we can also find solace for the days when we are discouraged and maybe even despairing. And that I think not nearly enough of us have that kind of connection to sustain us through the hard work of activism. And so in some sense, it's seeding that. And then also, it's a great space in which to connect with others and build relationships and learn to work together to be able to do big projects together. Both the kids that will hopefully eventually get to participate in the program, and also the adults who help to create the programming. Yeah, so at this point, it's a work in progress. And if folks are inspired by the basic idea and want to help shape it and direct it, please be in touch to let us know how you would like to do that. I think that's about what I have for now. I'm happy to, take questions when appropriate.
Yeah, so if anybody has some questions about I call it the outdoor school, and how it connects to the land and the farm, the animals that you have. I mean, there's a lot of stuff happening on your farm, and you do regenerative farming. So I wonder if anybody has any questions. How you mentioned, you used the term connection, right? I think that's such an important one. How everything connects, how people connect.
Yeah,
and people connect.
And I think what's also unique in a farm setting is that it allows for ongoing engagement with other beings, with the ecosystems, with land, and hopefully also creates a space where it is possible to imagine again that human impact on the land can actually be a net positive, that it's not just about minimizing our negative impacts, but we can actually start thinking about maximizing our positive impacts. So by what we plant and how we take care for the land, we can see positive changes over time. A really great example we have is that a couple of years ago when Thorsten and our kids cleaned out the bird boxes along our laneway, which is right beside our market garden, in spring, they actually accidentally woke up two nests of flying squirrels. And so the place that produces food for our human community is also able to be a home for flying squirrels. And that's just one species that is finding a home there too. So I think what's really powerful about a farm-based outdoor school is that we can be doing stuff that not only nourishes us, but at the same time we can discover, well, we can also be sharing the land again with other beings. It's not one or the other. We can do both at the same time. And I think that's a pretty powerful and inspiring experience for kids, and can hopefully get them dreaming and imagining all kinds of other possibilities that perhaps some of us older folks have a harder time imagining again, that those reciprocal relationships can actually be mutually beneficial.
Yeah, it seems like your education is based on reciprocity with the land. And some of us did read the Braiding Sweetgrass, and that's one of the major themes in it.
So currently we have the not-for-profit incorporated. We have offered our location as a possible site, and the board is working to figure out the operations. We aren't actually operating yet. This at this point is an idea, and it's a seed that we are hoping to nurture into germination and growth. So one possible site is our farm, but the idea is also that it's kind of a template so that it could be copied and then people can take it to their locations, because Grey Bruce is gigantic. You don't want to be driving super far for this kind of a program. So instead we're trying to create like a template that other folks can take and adapt to suit their location and replicate it. But we are right between Owen Sound and Sauble Beach. This is perhaps where the first one would be.
So you can go in Sound shopping and go to Sauble Beach swimming. But it's a great concept, right? It's a concept that could be transferred to other places. So the question, have you connected with other outdoor schools in Grey Bruce? There's one operating at Harrison Park in Owen Sound. Very cool stuff. How much demand is there for outdoor schools in our area? I think the one that's in Harrison Park is the forest school, from what I understand.
Yeah, and I think they have a little bit of a different focus in terms of their programming. So we have been in touch in the past with them. They had actually operated a day camp at our farm a few years ago. And we have been in touch with a number of other outdoor schools in Southern Ontario, especially the Guelph Outdoor School, which is also a not-for-profit, and they've been super generous about helping us on our way.
I'm interested in whether you have a vision around the young people involved becoming interested in regenerative farming, and is that kind of a hope that the young folks will not only be in a reciprocal relationship, but also want to move into that as their life work?
In general, in our society, so few kids at this point are exposed to agriculture,
Mm-hmm.
and that I think also really limits the number of people who would consider it as a possibility for them in the future. So
Mm-hmm.
yeah, I think one part of it is overall we need far more farmers. We're an old bunch. I at this point at 40 am definitely a young one amongst the farmers, and that's a really concerning state of affairs. So I think that is part of it, just exposing kids to farming. But I think there's also a huge benefit by just having everybody know a little bit more about farming. So as a farmer myself, I hire staff every year, and a lot of them are pretty young and in university, and I do a fair amount of training with them. So perhaps some of them will become farmers, but I think there's also a huge benefit for the young folks that end up not becoming farmers, having spent a season farming. So because they take that knowledge with them to all kinds of other endeavors. And I think that can be as fruitful as the kids that might become farmers themselves down the road.
Thanks. And I guess the piece around will virtues and spiritual content be part of the program also connects a bit with shifting focus to service that impacts climate issues that Sandra comments on here. Any thoughts on sort of the service, virtues, spiritual content of the program?
I think, yes, and this, so two parts. First, I think we want to give kids time for reflection connection, and that I think is in many ways perhaps the basis for talking about spirit and what that means. And I think that again is part of where, depending on who steps up in the community and helps shape this vision, they can help shape that as well, and to what extent and how in a sort of modern secular society do we start talking about spirit and our deepest beliefs and understandings of the world. How do we start talking about that again, and sharing that with us, with each other? And
so now I would like to introduce Kelsey Carriere. She is the president of the Glassworks. Many of you probably have heard about the Glassworks Cooperative. She is the president and founding board member of the Glassworks Co-op. Kelsey holds a master's in urban planning, sustainability planning, and urban design from the University of Toronto, as well as a bachelor's in science of environmental studies in environmental planning from York University and the University of Toronto. Kelsey has 4 years of research and policy coordinator and researcher experience, and presently she's a senior project manager at Park People in Toronto. Many might remember Kelsey from being a baker at the Owen Sound Market. She lives most of the time in Oxenden, and that's where her bakery used to be. Unfortunately, she can't attend in person tonight, so we pre-recorded it, and I hope it works. We did this about 10 days ago, and I think she did a great job in really diving deep into what this Glassworks Cooperative is, and I think many of us are really curious about this project. So, Leigh, are you ready to get it started? Oh yeah, and I want to say that once we had the presentation, Tanya Markvart will then also be able to, she's on the board of the Glassworks, so Tanya will be able to answer questions from everybody. But I will introduce her after the movie.
Hi, good evening. Thank you so much for having me. And I do apologize for not being able to be there in person, but I'm really grateful for technology for making my presence possible tonight. So thank you. My name is Kelsey Carriere. I am the president of the Glassworks Cooperative, focused on developing a sustainable, attainable, affordable housing community right here in Owen Sound. So my background, I grew up in Owen Sound, sort of born into an environmentalist family. My father wrote the book Passive Houses for Solar Climate, really looking at really simple and logical solutions to living lightly on the land. And I've been involved in community development projects most of my life, including the Pedestrian Sundays in Kensington Market, which I helped to co-found. And then went back to school to get my master's in urban planning to figure out how to take community-led initiatives that are really my passion to the next level, to figure out how to incorporate community-led and community scale innovations on a scale that will actually have a realistic impact on how we build and design. So that's what brought me to Glassworks today, and to be with y'all here tonight. So we see ourselves currently in the midst of 3 overlapping crises. Our housing crisis, obviously, just so greatly impacted in the last couple of years by the pandemic. I think the most recent numbers on average house prices in Owen Sound was $830,000 for a typical house purchase, and we know that that has been partnered with an also increase in rental and a diminishing of the availability of rental housing as well. At the same time, we're all super aware of the climate crisis at hand, and then this deep need for community that has become so apparent during the pandemic, really systems that reinforce how we look out for each other. And that's where Glassworks kind of lives, is at the crux of those 3 converging crises. So what we envision is an approach to tackling this desperate need for affordable housing and increasing the range of housing options that we can provide affordably, while at the same time recognizing this urgent need to innovate the way we build and live and get around to lessen our ecological footprint. And often these are seen as divergent, separate goals, but we know that with the right innovation and the right decision making, that they are very actually complementary goals. So all of this inspiration sort of comes together with a vision for a net zero community that produces local energy, that has systems built in both to the community design itself, the energy systems, the efficiencies, but also the living and community systems where that allows people to live comfortably in modest spaces and share large amenities, as opposed to everyone needing their own backyard and their own driveway and their own tool shed and their own guest room and their own dining room. That really taking a close look at what we need to live comfortably and what actually makes more sense and brings more joy to our lives to share. So from a planner's perspective, I like sort of taking a look back at how we got to now. And I feel like it's really time for to really rethink the fundamentals of how we plan community, including rethinking the basic geometry of what planning is. So often in the midst of these ongoing crises, we're continuing to build business as usual in individual boxes oriented towards an arbitrary street design. And so long as we're thinking like that, we're going to continue to build houses that don't accommodate options for living lighter on the planet. And just by on a very fundamental level, shifting our geometry and say, okay, houses don't necessarily live on a grid. They live in a planet. They live on a land that if they're solar oriented and they're thinking about what does a community need? Where does the energy come from? Where does the food come from? How can we steward the land upon which these houses are built? Then our planning model looks very different in a very fundamental way. So there's all sorts of great examples on various scales of eco-villages and communities that have taken an ecological approach that have sort of inspired our thinking. And the one at Ithaca Village in New York, I like referencing as an example because where that community was built was actually originally zoned for a subdivision. So the land had been subdivided into 101 acre lots and was meant to cover 90% of that property, with only 10% reserved for natural land because it was too steep or too wet for the developer to carve up. But that same piece of land, when the Ithaca Eco Village took it over and sort of re-envisioned what community could look like on that same piece of property, the same 100 units actually only took up 10% of the land. And we were able to maintain wildlands and agricultural land to support the community and the ecosystem. So it's just another example of sort of rethinking our geometry and how we live on the land from a planning perspective. And then you can see what this looks like on the ground. Instead of carving up our individual properties into our own backyards that sit empty 99% of the time, except when, maybe we have a birthday party or let the dog out in the morning, that we can trade that unused private space for community space where relationships are built, where folks play and get to know each other and build trust and, start scheming about other great projects that can be built to better the community as a whole. Another example is out in Chilliwack, BC. The Yarrow Eco Village had a similar model where it was previously agricultural land, and they were proposing roughly around 100 units as well. And the planning department was like, you can't do that. This is agricultural land, and it says that there's a maximum density for agricultural land, because very clearly they had envisioned what a normal developer would do, which is take prime agricultural land, chop it up into 1 or 2 or 5 acre lots, and therefore it's no longer functional to grow food. And thankfully, we do have some of these concepts in place to preserve important land uses. But the eco-village says, well, that's not what we're doing. We're not chopping up this agricultural land into private lots. We actually want to densify a wholesome community in one corner and maintain the agriculture for the rest of the space. And the solution that they found to surmounting an outdated planning bylaw was they invented a new one. They now have an ecosystem zoning bylaw in Chilliwack. So, just thinking about simple things like how to incorporate both ecological and affordable principles into a design. Indwell is based out of Hamilton, Ontario, and they do affordable net zero housing with really, really simple mechanisms, really taking advantage of passive solar, orienting the buildings appropriately, high energy efficiencies, and really careful selection of ecological building materials. And they're sort of leading the charge in Ontario for proving that ecological doesn't mean outrageously priced. So just coming back to how Glassworks works, we have a fantastic and dynamic board of directors representing both co-op housing development, affordable housing right here in Owen Sound, former councillors, the business community, and lawyers and planners. So a really super dynamic team, also supported by a whole bunch of really great advisors with background in housing and ecological design, and bringing a really strong Indigenous voice and design perspective to the way we've been thinking about Glassworks. And we're up over 150 members, with a couple dozen of them contributing on a monthly basis to financially support the project itself. We had over $100,000 raised directly from community members in order to purchase the land. And the membership is really growing, attracting people to the area. And we've been lucky enough to receive some really great funding who believe in this project. The Community Housing Transformation Center, their funding comes through CMHC, the Federal Housing Corporation, and they called this project the future of affordable housing. And we also were lucky just yesterday to receive news from the Federal New Horizons grant that's going to kickstart our official community design process next month, working in partnership with Giwe Indigenous Supportive Housing and Jonathan Redbird of One Dish, One Spoon, to really welcome current members and prospective future residents of Glassworks to dive right into the community design process with us. And the property itself is just on the east hill of Owen Sound, overlooking the water. It's 46 acres, and it borders 23rd and 26th Street, and has been, it's partially forested and has been partially hayed for decades. So it's a really beautiful landscape where we intend to maintain a lot of the biodiversity and wildlands, and sort of work within the confines of the landscape itself to bring a whole mix of uses, maintaining employment lands, recognizing that we're in a part of the town that was designated to maintain employment and job opportunities. We certainly see that as an integral part of the overall community design. We're welcoming prospective regenerative agriculture partners to work a part of the land that will also act as a natural buffer from our immediate industrial neighbors just south of the property. And then, by the time we get to the northern end of the property, we're about half a kilometer away from our existing industrial neighbors. And that's where we envision the housing being clustered in around a couple of beautiful creeks and old orchards, and on the far side of the woodland. So we're super happy to share just a little sneak peek of where we're at with the project. And always welcome new members and potential for co-creation and partnerships as we dive into our site plan development next month. So you can check us out at glassworks.coop. Make sure you sign up for our newsletter so you get updates and invites to upcoming events and gatherings, including the Earth Day gathering at the Farmers Market on the 23rd of April. We'll be there in the afternoon. You can come and say hi and learn a lot more about the project. So thanks so much for having us tonight.
Thank you so much, Kelsey. That was a really great kind of a condensed way of looking at Glassworks Cooperative. I just have one first question. So this is kind of a novel idea around here to put together and to bundle environmental stewardship and affordable housing. Just wondering about the whole issue of climate change. Like how do you see how Glassworks Cooperative and the project will have a positive impact on lowering our climate carbon footprint?
Yeah, great question. So we know that our national energy use related to our buildings and residences is almost 30% of the energy we use. You know, we've got a lot of old building stock, and although we know it's coming down the pipeline in our building code, I think it's 2030, that they're aiming to include net zero as one of the standards in the building code, but we're not there yet, and we're not moving there fast enough. And the way we envision, I mean, we all know about ecological houses and just how incredibly energy efficient they can be by using both passive solar in the way we orient the buildings, and heat stores, and shade to block out the sun in the summer when we're trying to keep the places cooler, by producing energy on site. And also the other really cool thing about having the opportunity to work with a large piece of land and not trying to cram an intention for ecological living into like house by house, is that we have opportunities to explore district heating, where we have one central common heating system that provides for the whole community. And that's something that just, it doesn't happen if you're developing one lot at a time, or you're trying to, upgrade an existing house to be, more energy efficient. There's only so much you can do when you're working one house or one lot at a time. And yeah, the opportunity to design on a community scale really brings in just incredible opportunities for that type of innovation and those types of efficiencies that, we see all over the world. I know in Germany, it's quite common to build in that context, to have, often associated with common green spaces, the energy production system, or a central heating or a heat sink. So it's high time to bring that kind of innovative forward thinking to our communities, where we know people are really passionate about taking action on climate.
That makes a lot of sense, and there are lots of models that we can look at that show us that we can move forward on climate change and climate action and affordable housing, because it doesn't necessarily have to cost a lot more. I mean, it will cost more, but it's not out of this world, obviously. Just another question. Transportation is another big area of having large carbon footprints. The neat thing is that the people don't have to drive to each other, because they're all there and they're on the land. So any ideas how Glassworks will be connected to the city of Owen Sound and to services there?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's a couple really great connections with transportation, which inspired the purchase of the particular location that we did. One is it's right beside the rail trail. So we have one of the nicest, gentlest slopes into downtown of anywhere in the city, because we all know every other hill is pretty treacherous by bike or even on foot. So that's a real draw to the location. There's also a bus route goes right by 9th Avenue, which is just a 5-minute walk from the property already. And we also know that a lot of us, of course, we need cars to get around between cities or to our jobs. But a lot of us have cars that we need sometimes that are just sitting there 90% of the time. And we envision also bringing in car share models into the community, because why does everyone have to own a car, pay for separate insurance, pay for separate parking and maintenance and paying off of the vehicle when it's literally sitting there 90% of the time? So for folks that is a possibility, I think it's a really great option to be able to be incorporating into the whole design process. And that's, when we did our survey of prospective future residents, over half of the folks were interested in car sharing as opposed to bringing their own. And that's, another way that this links back to affordability. I've been talking with lots of folks about sort of affordable housing on a rural level, and a car can be a very significant amount of your expenses. And if we can design spaces where people aren't dependent on a car, then it actually frees up income for our housing. So that's sort of an integral part of thinking about overall affordability. And, we're not just talking about how to create the same spaces that we always have cheaper and also magically environmentally conscious, but really kind of rethinking on a fundamental level, what brings us value in our housing. And if it's beautifully designed, it's warm, it's comfortable, and has all the privacy you need, that can be accomplished in a really quite modest and affordable way. And then having access to sort of community level amenities that aren't required. And, it allows you to maintain just like an overall lighter footprint. If you need less furniture and you need less resources to heat and electrify your house, because it was designed well to begin with.
Well, that sounds all super exciting, how all these different perspectives are integrated into one. And the old saying, location, 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 is really a very well thought through one in where you want to have the Glassworks. Just one more question. I know these projects can be a major uphill battle, and I'm just wondering how we in our community and communities, how we can support you the best way.
Absolutely. What a wonderful question. Thank you. And even for hosting us tonight, it's really wonderful to be part of this conversation. Absolutely. Make sure you're signed up for our newsletter, because there will be all sorts of opportunities to get involved. It's an election year, making sure that your councillors know that climate and housing are at the top of your list, and that that they're not two separate issues, and that of a wonderful project in the community that's really trying to tackle it head on. Come out and visit us on Earth Day at the farmers market and get all caught up. We'll be sort of developing campaigns in relation to the upcoming election to really get the word out there and share great updates, and get involved. We have all sorts of dynamic committees. We're actually just this year starting our membership committee as we really start thinking about broadening from a beautiful vision with these wonderful supporters that have helped it get this far, to starting to see who are the future residents of Glassworks and really building that solid voice as well. And we have all sorts of opportunities to jump in and get engaged and support with grant writing and event organizing, and being on our energy research committee and joining the community design process. There's 100 ways to be directly involved in helping move the project forward, and really just talking it up amongst your community networks, and letting folks know that this is one of those great projects where so many of the urgent needs and really fantastic vision come together in one place, and we could really as a community let Owen Sound be the spotlight of innovative community development. I know we have a community that supports and is really passionate about that kind of vision, and together we can make it happen. And wouldn't Owen Sound love to be that shining star on the map of progress?
Thanks, Tanya, for sitting in tonight. So by day, Tanya Markvart works full-time in outreach and education for Parks Canada. And by night, she is an artist and painter. She has an academic background in planning and environmental studies from the University of Waterloo, where her graduate research focused on why people and organizations change and why they resist change towards greater sustainability. In her spare time, Tanya undertakes research and analysis for the Canadian Environmental Law Association. A few years ago, Tanya started up an art-based fundraising organization called Show Your Love, Art by People for the Planet. And she uses this social enterprise as a vehicle for raising funds for environmental charities dedicated to protecting wildlife and natural habitat. That's a wonderful bio, isn't it? And thanks for being here, Tanya. So if folks, if you have questions about Glassworks, you can throw them right at Tanya, who is on the board of Glassworks.
And Jenny, are there any questions in the chat?
Oh, sorry. The one I'm seeing is from Jeanette, which is exclamation marks about how wonderful it sounds. But wondering, while you say that membership's growing, Tanya, are you finding it a hard sell? It just seems like such a no-brainer, but is it actually a hard sell with perhaps the less innovative thinkers and funders, perhaps?
It's a really great question, because the membership is part of the funding base, the funding foundation for Glassworks. And so eventually the vision is to rely a lot on membership as well as other grants. So I wouldn't say it's a hard sell. I would say that it's something that we're really interested in growing and that we place a lot of value on and priority on. And we really want to take a creative membership-based approach to designing Glassworks. So part of the charrette process for the design of the cooperative housing units will be to engage with the members and to create community among the members, so that the place where they live is designed according to their vision, which is very grounded in community values and community building. So I would say it's a fun way to meet people, and it's something that we really value, and definitely a priority in terms of growing the membership, and we always welcome new members. So I hope that answers
Beautiful.
your question.
It's really a ground up community development approach, which is a beautiful thing to see. There's one more question from Janice Fisher. Is there any timeline for building / occupancy? Has the zoning been settled, and is Glassworks supported by council? So that's a triple barreled question. You can see it in the chat.
It certainly is. And what I will say is that the land is currently not zoned residential, and that the process for that to be approved is one that will require a lot of strategic thinking and planning and negotiation with Owen Sound and their official plan process, and some of their other planning decisions around affordable housing and use of land. With respect to timeline, there is no set date. So in some ways, as far as I know, as a board member, it's an adventure that we're all on together. And of course, the outcome is to see Glassworks as a beautiful built community-based cooperative housing design. And that's the goal. How long it will take to get us there will hopefully happen within the next decade. So,
okay. And in terms of council,
if Kelsey were here, she would be able to answer that question more accurately. She has a better, I guess, handle on that vision for timing. So,
Right. So there's a kind of an organic growing and timing around it as there needs to be for any kind of ground up approach. Where's council at? Because that would be the planning piece, right? In terms of zoning, that you're going to need to have support. I'm thinking to Joachim's question around how can we help? It's going to come to for rezoning application, and it's something that, you know, folks could have input on if they chose to. But anything around that in terms of the council of Owen Sound Council and the county support?
There is, however, I'm not quite sure how much information in that regard I should make public in this venue. I'm so sorry. I would have to refer that question back to Kelsey just to be safe. And we would welcome that question. So if you like, I can forward that on to Kelsey and then get back to you. And then perhaps in this feedback process, we can answer that question more clearly.
That's
if
great.
that's okay.
That's
Totally
very fair, Tanya.
Awesome.
But I have a bit of kind of public knowledge that I got from kind of out of the air about this. So officially, this land is zoned as employment land or something like it, right? And so it's tricky.
That's correct.
Have it residential, but obviously employment is part of this project. And also we have a great need for affordable housing in Owen Sound. So, and Kelsey kind of mentioned things in her presentation. So it's really important for those of us here who elect the next municipal council are really kind of on top of this issue. I think it's a really, really important one. Okay.
I agree. And just to add to that too, and to build on Kelsey's point around in response to your question about how Glassworks contributes to the climate crisis and solutions to climate change, is the whole idea that affordable housing is a way to bring about equitable solutions to climate change, in the sense that most solutions are oriented towards, just in terms of how they're conceptualized and implemented, towards people of higher incomes. And so often people of lower income, single mothers, people with just one income are often left out of those solutions because they can't afford them, or so they're not oriented towards that demographic. So I think to have an affordable housing cooperative that attempts to make housing more accessible to lower incomes is one way to create more equitable solutions to climate change in the long term. So, yeah.
It'd be really interesting to have a bit of conversation about the climate justice aspects of all of these pieces as well, because you're absolutely right that, and it's a space for innovation and to think quite differently about climate solutions.
Especially in the crafting of climate disasters. They're often people of lower incomes are often completely left out, and the solutions are not accessible to them at all. And while Owen Sound may not, pardon?
They're often hardest hit, besides being a solution. Yeah. And
while Owen Sound may not be subject to that scale of a climate disaster, the affordable housing concept is still one that fits into that more equitable, accessible model.
Great. I think what makes sense to move on to Thorsten, because there's a couple of questions that may be really good sort of panel discussions related to whether there's these kinds of innovations are happening in other places. So does that make sense? Joachim, do you want to move along to Thorsten, and then we can bring everybody together with some common threads? Yeah, great.
Yeah, one common thread so far was the term connection, to connect. So let's move to Thorsten Arnold, who is quite familiar to many of us here in Grey Bruce. And he is the partner of Kristine, who we heard earlier. And they have 2 kids and they live on a farm together. So Thorsten is a food system analyst, advocate and consultant with Grey Bruce Center for Agroecology. He's also a local regenerative farmer at Persephone Market Garden, and is championing a new 2-year project called Regenerate Grey Bruce, which you can learn about on the Sustainability Project website. Tonight, he will briefly overview his paper called Innovative Structures Towards Land Access that outlines some potential solutions to the farming crisis, biodiversity crisis, and the climate crisis. So lots of things kind of coming together there. And I just learned at the beginning that Thorsten lived just a few kind of 100 meters away from where I grew up in Germany. It's when he was studying there. Anyway, take it away, Thorsten. Thanks for being here.
Thank you, Joachim. And yeah, thank you all for staying with us. One of the big questions I was asked, what the heck does that have to do with the climate crisis? Looking at our planet under pressure, there is not just climate change, and climate change makes the media in the last years. But if you look at the planet's boundaries, sustainability boundaries, then genetic and functional biodiversity is a really big issue. Also geochemical flows, nitrogen, phosphorus, and land system change. And climate change, like for me, it's often difficult to conceptualize how can we, like, it seems like there's a long list of problems that all need to be addressed, and it's kind of daunting, but we can also say it's actually quite much easier. We have a living biosphere that's everything on this earth that's not rocks or water. Everything else is life. And then we have a climate change, which means all this life is heating up a little bit. And to understand the role of biosphere, I see it very much as our shield, as our buffer against climate change, because the biosphere regulates a large part of the water cycle, and the water itself is responsible for about 95% of the energy flows on Earth. So all this heating is much worse if we do it dry. And that's very easy to explain. If you walk on a parking lot that's asphalted and dry, you will feel very hot in a summer day, and then you can go under a shaded area and it's much less hot. But then you go under a tree that actually transpires water, and then you can feel much cooler under that tree. So that if we have global warming, we're best off having a living, vibrant biosphere to protect us. And unfortunately, like going back to this graph, 4 or 5 of the big pressures of our planet are destroying our biosphere. That's our insurance against climate change. And we can then say, okay, how does biosphere degradation look like? And we'll see it looks very different in every place. Desertification in a temperate region as ours looks quite different than it does in a hot zone in the tropics. But if you look at this image from southwestern Ontario, then we can see that even our areas have been under tremendous pressure of desertification, soil erosion, and basically a disruption of the entire water cycle. This is a picture from 1905. Here we have some other pictures that are from I think the top is from the 30s. No, that's also 1905. So they're all from this book, 2 Billion Trees and Counting, that kind of looks at historic disastrous land use change here in Ontario, and then also how we brought it back, because we can do that as managers of ecosystems. If the climate is changing, my preferred scenery or landscape would kind of look like that. We have wooded areas where animals can live, where plants are full, and where the forests make clouds. So this cooling aspect of a healthy landscape is really important. But look at all those little farm properties which are kind of dispersed, and they're all diverse, and they all have like this rich green cover, a lot of trees. This is a scenario, even though there's people living, the houses aren't the problem. The problem is the impact of the housing on the landscape. Kelsey spoke to that fantastically. But also agroecology or building relationship with the land has to do with how you farm. And ultimately understanding the land requires that you build these relationships. So I was interviewing a bunch of farmers about their likelihood to pick up regenerative practices. And the one thing that, because regenerative practices regenerate the landscape, make us more resilient in a changing climate. And the number one answer that people gave to me about why they don't do regenerative farming is because we don't own our land and we cannot buy our land. It's not affordable. It's outside of our reach. It's too expensive. And so land ownership is really a dramatic limitation to creating resilient landscapes. And so I dug into this and kind of, you can download this if you go to my website and just look at the innovative structures toward land access. There's a report to download. It's more a compendium than a report. I basically just collected a bunch of different approaches. And looking at land prices in Canada, they have been rising around the 20% value per year, down to even 5%. Now with COVID, it's going up again. These are brand new, like they're 3 days old data. If we look in Ontario, or if we look across different provinces, we can see that in Ontario, the land price last year has risen by 22%, which is way ahead of the curve. And then we can dig in deeper and look at the land prices by county or by region, they call this. And then we can see that there's this belt. It's the 3 and 4. That's kind of far away from Toronto, but still in reach. And this is where the land prices really have exploded most. These are average land prices. I would like to add that for small scale ecological farmers, it's even more dramatic because ecological farmers like kind of marginal land, and marginal land didn't used to have a high value because farmers don't like it. And now we have this tremendous pressure from cottagers or even people who move into rural areas and build on marginal land. And so I would say in this area, the land prices in the last couple of years have doubled for land that normally ecological farmers would buy. So farmers basically are priced out of, or new farmers are basically priced out of the market. We don't get more new farmers who want to apply ecological practices. Those farmers who already own land are pretty lucky, and I'm really glad we got into the market 10 years ago. We can see that there is less interest in internships on our own farm. There's just less people who want to learn about ecological agriculture, because that dream is no longer feasible for most people who grew up in the suburbs and the cities. And I find this really scary, because this means that land increasingly gets bought up by institutional investors, corporations, pension funds, people who don't build any relationship to the farm because they're living somewhere far away and don't even know what's happening on their land. They hire a manager, and the manager sends the trucks or the equipment operators in. And so I believe if we really want to have a resilient landscape, land access is one of the core questions that we as a society need to talk about. This is not a problem that farmers can solve alone. because those who drive the prices are not farmers, they're investors. And I think most people on the call probably own agricultural land somehow through their portfolio investments, through their pension funds, and so in a way, our entire society is partly responsible for this phenomena. I kind of think we have to shift gear as ecological farmers. Instead of trying to pull more people into the farming world, we now have to create spaces for ecological farmers to farm. And just checking the time. So what I did is I just looked at a bunch of different ideas how we could own land collectively. And we started off with just plain government ownership. There's two initiatives that are worth looking at, that I found worth looking at. One is the open space in Colorado. And there the governments have established like a mechanism how communities can buy land, convert it into parkland or other collective forms of land. Some of it is farmland, some of it is recreational, some of it is nature reserve. And those open spaces have exploded in Colorado. You can see how many there are now. And now the community can again decide how this land is being governed. But there's another example quite close. That's the community pastures in Ontario. A conservative government once purchased large flocks of land in the range of 15,500 acres in Kincardine, for example. And those are grazed collectively. And they're actually pretty nice landscape pieces. So even in Ontario, we do that. You hear very little about it, but we have this precedent even right in our backyard here in Great Bruce. Investor ownership, I added in because it's also a non-private land form of land ownership. The corporate land holdings are basically publicly traded corporations. All they do is they buy land and they rent it out. They normally do that with annual lease agreements, and that's the big cash cropping that you see in our region quite a bit. There's also, of course, a lot of land cash cropped that's owned privately, but more and more we can see corporate investors taking over. And so if a pension fund wants to invest in land, then they normally don't buy their own land, but they purchase shares in corporate land holdings. And that makes it really, really intransparent what actually happens on the land and who owns the land. And for a farmer, we could lease that land, and a lot of people do, but you always just get an annual 1-year contract. And you cannot invest in soil health. You cannot invest in trees, because by the time the benefits accrue, you may not be on that land anymore. There's some idea about developing regenerative land holdings, and those are basically the very same models, but they have some stipulations in their lease agreements that talk about how you can farm them or what type of outcomes you're expected to do. That's a slight variation, but still the difficulty there remains that you still don't know how long is your contract with that land. But that's a big improvement. There is a bunch of land trusts and charity ownership of land that then also allow communities. One of the most interesting one is the Southeast Farmers of Color Land Trust. They started off as an equity project to make land accessible to colored people in the States. But they now also have more and more active policy work. So they are kind of lobbying that every community in their state, I don't remember whether it's Minnesota, I think it's Minnesota, every community needs to buy one piece of land and establish a Farmers of Color Land Trust. So they try to replicate their system throughout the entire state. We have some land trusts here, but they're normally not allowing farming. They're normally replanting trees and then sell carbon offsets to basically pay for the administration of it. I think it's quite a different paradigm whether you want to integrate people into a healthy landscape or whether you want to push people out of the landscape so that it then recuperates. So I'm more a fan of this integration. How do you bring people into a landscape? Eco-villages, this is a picture from Germany, Schloss Tempelhof. There once was a village for sale and it got transformed into an eco-village, and it's one of the most vibrant communities that I know of. And they also integrate farmland. So you can see here in the top, there's a bunch of acreage being farmed. There's some haying going on, but overall it's one way how farmers can access land. And then there are some more complex mechanisms, and this one, it's the older one is a German cooperative that purchases land. Citizens purchase land as cooperative members, and then farmers can also become members as a farmer member and use this land. And they can actually build equity through this mechanism. It has recently been adopted to the United States, and it's all English there. It's translated. It's called the Agrarian Commons in the USA. And I find this is one of the most powerful programs because it's kind of like a CSA, like what we have. It's just that the land is actually purchased by the customers. And then the customers have a lot of decision power what to do about it. Not so much geared towards land are some regional value community funds, and they basically raise money from community members to rebuild strategic infrastructure in a community that is lacking. And the idea there is that this is an entrepreneurial approach. All of these projects need to generate income, but they generate income very slowly. So you couldn't get money through the regular banking system or investors. Like Local Grey Bruce is a good example. It's a great community service, but nobody gets rich on it, but we all benefit from it. So this regional value community fund, they built those they strategically finance those barriers to larger growth. And yeah, it's not much different than a charity. It's just it's an investment vehicle. So all of these examples I detailed a bit more in this report. And of course, there's cooperative farm ownership, and there's just informal partnerships with landowners. But overall, I think what I've learned is ecological farming will not grow because of land access issues. We need new venues for land ownership. Communities can step in there. Overall, I think this will also not change our landscapes. I think ultimately, I see community land ownership as creating space for knowledge keepers. If our society decides to regenerate land at landscape scale, this would need to have a much stronger driver from our urban society, and really change the game, the rules of the game. It's not going to be like, it's not an emergent process that comes from inside of the farming sector. So those are some ideas I wanted to share. I think there's a lot of detail. Please download the report if you have more questions. Yes, FarmLink is a great resource, Sandra. I know a lot of farmers who Like the biggest problem with farming is if you don't own the land, you really have problems because you don't build equity. Where we don't save we don't have any retirement savings, which is from a climate perspective great, because the biggest footprint of all of us is our investment, and the only investment that we have is our land. And so if you're with FarmLink, then it's easy to find land that you can farm for 1 to 5 years, but ultimately you have zero security on your land through FarmLink. So that's one of the caveats of farmland.
Thanks so much, Thorsten. I think there's a couple of questions here and then some that have come previously that you may want to respond to as well. Just the second part of the question from Sandra, and also just for some of our understanding, can you just give us an idea what FarmLink is, just quickly? It's another paradigm, sort of another model for folks to use land that they don't own. Is that?
Well, it's basically a website. If I'm a farmer or if I'm a landowner, a lot of cottagers, they buy a farm and use the land as a cottage, and then they have all this land without knowing what to do with it. So they normally, most of them just rent it out to a cash cropper, then it's a corn monoculture. And if you don't want to do that and want to find a farmer where you have some more take on what to do with it, then you can post your land on FarmLink and say, if there's any beginning farmer who wants to farm, yeah, you can rent this land.
But it's not, you don't have any equity.
No, it's not equity, and very often it comes without housing. And we know we have to live on our farm just to take care of our animals. And even just to observe what's happening on a day-to-day basis. So
what about Ecological Farmers Association that Sandra references? Is that something that?
Yeah, the Ecological Farmers Association of Ontario is a efao.ca is their website. Great, or like one of my favorite organizations. I actually did this report, was kind of a side product from doing a project for them on regenerative agriculture. Okay. They're a great organization, but they give you knowledge. The big issue in agriculture is not knowledge, it's assets.
Yeah, equity, assets, exactly. Yeah, there are a number of questions that have come up in the questions section that are related to a higher question, but I just want to go back to a couple of pieces that we didn't get to, and then we'll kind of see how these pieces all fit together, because they do absolutely, the innovations and projects that we've been hearing about. There was a comment to Kristine's piece about the school from Aaron saying that farming focused programs.
There used to be a high school system in Kelsey that taught farming as part of the schooling, and yeah, that was just removed partly because the idea was that farming is so technological that you can teach it in schools. And yeah, I disagree. I think ecological farming or agroecological farming is a very different beast, where you really have to learn to read ecosystems. It's a bit like parenting a child is different than maintaining a machine. And I think the skill sets of agroecology are much more comparable with parenting a child, whereas a lot of the industrial farming approach skills are more like tending a machinery. And so the soft skills for parenting cannot be taught in a university setting. You have to do it by living on land with living things. So that's I think why it's so important for children to experience that on a day-to-day basis.
And that is also related to a comment or question, I think, that came from Barry Randall that Kristine responded to around the paradigms of forest school as a take nothing, leave nothing, as opposed to ecosystem management and restoration, and that a relationship. I don't know if I think Kristine responded to that really beautifully. Yes. And succinctly. So
Yeah, it's a reciprocity that she spoke about. It's a give and take. It's not just either giving or taking or just observing. So it's being actively engaged, actually.
Yeah.
Even natural parks aren't natural because we don't have the caribou herds. We don't have the 10 billion passenger pigeons that used to bring fertility to each area. So since we don't have that anymore, we don't have wilderness in the sense that that it existed before settler intake. So now we have to be the caribous. We have to be those herds and take care of the landscape the way that wild animals used to.
Mm-hmm.
There's a question that actually relates in a strange way to that, because I don't think that their practice is a caribou practice. So from Barry Randall, what percentage of agricultural land in Grey Bruce is owned by large corporations who simply rent to large companies who plant and harvest cash crop? Is this trend changing at all? So that's a different system, right?
It's I don't know those numbers, and it's terribly hard to get those numbers because whether you're incorporated as a family or as a
numbered company
holding, they're all just numbers. And even the large investors, they don't invest in one number, so you can find the same number across Ontario, but they have hundreds of smaller numbered companies, and so it's actually a mystery where you have to do a lot of research on like in the end, most of the land that's currently being cash cropped will change ownership in the next years because the owners are getting older and older. The average age of a farmer is kind of between 65 and 70. And those people, as they retire and sell their land, a lot of them own 800,000 or 1,000 acres, and that's worth like $10 million. So if you put one property for $10 million, or one connected property, one farm for $10 million on the market, the only institutions that can buy it are institutional investors, pension funds, because no individual has this money.
What you spoke about in your presentation was the agrarian commons.
Yes, fantastic website
concept. Do you have any ideas how communities can move towards that? Like what would be first steps to take to move there? I think Glassworks actually in some way would be an example in a bit of a different way, but it integrates agriculture.
Yep,
the idea was that the community buys the land and the farmers work the land.
Yeah, and what they do is they say there's a commons area, so you have to find your members in that region. For example, if we wanted to buy, let's say, a 200-acre property in the Owen Sound area, then we would say, okay, includes Owen Sound to Wyerton, and we have to find a certain number of members, and those people then buy the land. They get some money, they get a lot of in-kind returns, but the core problem is you cannot pay with land from what you get from the land. Land is purely speculative. You make money with land by owning it and holding it and selling it later. And this idea of getting money from it every year simply doesn't work. And even if you look at our farm, we made whatever $20,000 last year with our farming operation that included my wife working 6 months full-time on it and me working every day 2 hours on it. That makes 20,000 profit. We made about 150,000 in land value increase. I mean, that land is just paper money because we can't buy anything with it. But it's for a young person who 5 years ago said, I'm going to put money away every year to buy land, they're not getting closer to their land, they're moving backwards. And that's a terrible situation.
Yeah. So we've heard three really exceptional innovations that are climate conscious, but that also are in that space of innovation, but they're groundbreaking, and a lot of heavy lifting. There's a lot of work that has to be done in order to make these kinds of innovations that are going to, be solutions going forward to some of the climate challenges that we're facing. How do we start to pave the way? How do we grow these ideas? How do we scale them? How do we help? Because clearly, where we live and how we live, where we grow our agricultural products and manage our biodiversity, and where we learn, where our kids learn, those are climate solutions. How do we do more? How do we move it forward? How do we pave the way on more of this? In imagining, as I think Kelsey said, that we want to be an innovator, and there's some great groundwork here. What do we need to do? I guess I would ask each of you around that. How do we move forward more and expand and do more of this innovative work in the space of?
Let's ask all three panelists in order there.
Well, I think that you're really talking about a process of social and cultural change, which is often a very slow moving variable, and it can take multiple generations for any kind of culturally embedded norm or culturally economically embedded norm to shift to become viable on a larger scale. But that said, it all starts with one person, a handful of people, communities getting together, start out at the fringes and start conversations and discourses, and certain ideas, sometimes for unpredictable reasons, catch on and they get a lot of momentum behind them. Usually, I think one of the big reasons for that momentum is financial or political. It somehow fits in with the way that things currently are, even though it's still innovative, it still kind of fits in, or it's totally disruptive, and it takes up a really needed space that disrupts a system that was probably failing and on its way out in the first place. So, but at the end of the day, when we're talking about these kind of community initiatives that pop up, but are also really grounded in ideas that exist all over the world, and they've existed for a long time. Like this cooperative model is not, it's old, it's really, really old. And it's just kind of resurfacing now for, really good reasons again. And so I think it just takes people like us getting together and continuing the conversation and really just pushing these ideas forward and believing that eventually some of them will percolate up and get some momentum. Yeah.
And will be demonstrated. I mean, that's what you're doing. You're all taking action to do it. Is Kristine around still, or is she, where do we go now?
I think that the biggest thing is leadership in the beginning. I think Eat Local Grey Bruce has shown that once we have a system running, it actually runs. It's a not-for-profit business that reinvests everything back into the community. So we don't need to have everything for profit, and a lot of aspects can be. But how do you get it running? That's the core question. And with the Bruce Grey Outdoor School, our biggest challenge is just getting from the sense of there's a need to it's there. There's no, you cannot, it's really hard to get financing for something that works. but that doesn't exist yet. Like startups, no investor wants to put money into startup. Eat Local Grey Brews works because one of our long-term friends wrote me a check of $50,000 without a charity receipt, without question asked. He did it based on trust. He looked us in the eye and said, I want you to have this. What do you want to do with it? And we said, I want to start a co-op. And he was like, no, buy yourself a greenhouse, build something. And we said, no, we want to build a co-op. But this community member, by putting $50,000 into my hand, he really this trust was a big burden for Eat Local Grey Brews to succeed. And it was a great inspiration for the farming community when I said, we have a vehicle and we can leverage a grant with that vehicle. And suddenly the community was there and believed in it. They believed in me as a startup manager. And it just created this sense of, yes, we can. And with Bruce Grey Outdoor School, at the moment, we don't have that feeling yet. We're kind of trying to pull ourselves out of the mud on our own hair, and that's hard. So yeah, that I find getting started and finding, we don't have a culture of trusting each other. It's so easy to create a for-profit that I own myself, where all the burden is on me. And as soon as we have a board involved in a group, then people get super conservative, cautious, and want to do something super perfect. This is not how for-profits work. For-profits work like I just do it and then deal with the problems. And so we don't have a culture of getting this momentum going. And this is why Glassworks is such a tremendous startup effort, because we don't know how to create movements.
I used a great term here, Thorsten, like trust. And I think that's kind of at the bottom of many things we feel we need to do, but don't know how to do it when it comes to social justice and climate change and all the other ecological issues around it. It would be great to have more conversations about it, how to get there. I know, Tanya, you did research on why people change or not change, right? So if there's a basic mistrust as part of our paradigm, it's not easy to really move forward and make major changes. We have to have a trust that we can do it, right? And I think Glassworks works really hard on that one. So we realize we want to come to a closure soon.
I do want to point out that we've been chipping away slowly over the past like 6 or 7 climate forums on the issue of housing. We touched on development and housing with Joyce Hall when we did a thing on change, and we did some we touched on tiny homes, and we did a climate forum on reduce. But we really only skimmed the surface. And even tonight, I feel like we haven't really got any sort of clear takeaway on the correlation between affordable housing and how bringing people up helps everyone succeed at climate action, like sort of a holistic idea of bringing people up and bringing those lesser fortunate up. Is there anyone, is there Joyce or is there Tanya? Because I know Joyce is in the room. Is there anyone that wanted to make that tie for us?
Hi, yeah, there is we can to look for really good people to run for municipal council who are climate activists. So I feel a little bit two-faced about it, because I feel like I'd love to go and look for climate activists that would run for council, but I'm not willing to do it myself. but I think that's part of it. Getting climate activists in positions in council, and of course changing the Ontario government. that would certainly help too. That's my 2 cents worth.
Joyce, in terms of the affordable social housing, that the innovation and the need for new models and more volume, how do you see that as a climate justice issue, and what do we need to do more focus on that, because it seems they're pretty overwhelmingly related?
Yeah, one of the things that that some of the jurisdictions are doing is that they require any builder who's building housing to set aside a certain amount and in the affordable, it should be in the affordable category. What do they call it? Inclusionary. They call it inclusionary zoning. And like instantly, you get the private sector producing housing. We certainly have a culture in Canada of housing being provided by the private sector. It would be great to start shifting that. But for now, since that's what we're stuck with, inclusionary zoning would be a great thing to ask our councils to include, in their policy. So any builder who wants to build has to create some inclusionary zoning. I think that my own municipality, Grey Highlands, got rid of minimum house size, which I think is great. Certainly the silliest idea that we ever came up with, and it was pushed by builders, apparently, the building trades, was getting bigger and bigger and bigger minimum house sizes. That was dumb, The draft Grey County Climate Action Plan also calls for intensification in already existing settlement areas. So don't sprawl into farmland. So that's also a really great initiative that will save farmland and hopefully produce smaller, more densified housing of varying types. So those are the kinds of things we can push for municipally.
Maybe we'll have a climate forum dedicated session on this issue. We had Celeste, thank you, Joyce, and for unprompted, just jumping in. So we had Celeste Smith from a cooperative called Giddy Gemi Gemic, or it's We Will Plant Lodge up in Manitoulin Island. That's sort of tying together all these issues about land trust, land ownership, getting young people into farming, because young people seem to be the ones that are more typically doing ecological farming. And Celeste also worked extensively with land trusts, and she's on the escarpment biosphere. So hopefully we're going to have her back too. And we also reached out tonight to the Whole Village, which is the established eco-village in Orangeville. And they were unable to come. Celeste wanted to come and was all lined up to come, but she got sick. But there's a different way. There seems to be just a bunch of ways to addressing the problem of land ownership, like Thorsten is saying. Before we conclude, I just wanted to know if there's any one of the models, maybe a question for Thorsten, is which one of these models, like the Bruce Community Pasture or a land trust, which one of the ones could you foresee happening here most easily without all this, with all this extra heavy lifting?
I think the agrarian trust is a model that I really like. It's a collaboration between urban or normal citizens and young farmers. I can also imagine a value corporation, a regional value corporation, where citizens invest money into building strategic infrastructure barriers that don't need to create profit, but they also cannot lose money. So they basically need to break even and just need money to get started. If governments were different, I certainly think we could just get money bought by governments. That is working, that's the Northeast Farmers of Colorland Trust has lobbied extensively, and that's what's happening now, is that they get more and more municipalities just buy land and make it available for people of color. And that's part of a much larger indigenization movement in the United States now. Like they're actually the leaders there. So it's really an interesting model. Also seeing how they branched out from just being somebody who owns one farm to somebody who starts to build huge networks. Land trusts are from donations, tend to get land from donations. And I know there's a lot of people who want to preserve land in this area, and I don't see why that shouldn't be done through land trusts. Right now, we mostly do wilderness preservation, but building this third path of a intensively partnered like human nature interaction in the same way that eco-villages do that. Can also be done through a land trust, and that's a model which I would like to see, where people, as they get older, they say, okay, I have 1,000 acres, they are worth 12 million or whatever. I put from those maybe 100 acres into a land trust for others to farm, and my family is still happy enough with the 9 millions, like they can legally fight battles over that money once I'm demised.
That might be an idea. That might be an idea for a future climate forum to look at different examples, not necessarily the kind of working here right now. Although I know Michael Schmidt, for instance, who was on Climate Forum before, he had his land into a land trust, but now I think he's moving further with that, and maybe we can invite him back again about that. I think one thing that stood out for me when I listened to Kelsey was that we often think that different paradigms are incompatible. So for instance, affordable housing and ecological living, or living with a small footprint, is not compatible, right? Actually, it's the other way around. What she showed in her presentation was that actually it makes a lot of sense, because people who don't have much money also can't afford all the things they have to invest to reduce their personal climate footprint, carbon footprint. So there's a lot of stuff that could be explored where things seem to be incompatible, but actually they are really compatible and actually complement each other. And I come back to the word connection, connectivity.
There's one just quick comment. What Joyce Hall mentioned, this word intensification, and I know that planners are talking about that, to keep all settlements around the existing waterworks. And I think eco-villages are kind of stepping out of that. They are somehow intensifying on compared to a normal subdivision, but they are also giving a lot of open space. And I think that's an interesting alternative, that if we talk intensification in urban areas, we should be aware that the eco-villages is a parallel model that we can keep in the discourse. So I
think Tanya would say that the same with the Glassworks having an area of more intensive, the housing and co-housing, and allowing for an amount of property for agricultural use, that kind of an idea that there's a place for each of those pieces, but we don't need, 1 acre lots with monster homes on them, and we shouldn't have them. We shouldn't. Well, I find the connection with climate justice a really interesting one, and what has come up around the disproportionate impacts of climate change on populations, on certain parts of the world. And to me, the responses around the kinds of agricultural, ecological agriculture practices and affordable community, affordable housing within broader communities. I mean, and the education, they're all ways of thinking about how to increase equity and access, and also really consider, how to build conscious communities, whether they're farming or living or employment. Yeah. So I find that really interesting. And I love that Thorsten ends with, yes, we can. And I love the language of live lightly on the land that came through today too. So, and I'm a community developer from, way back and at heart. So hearing about Glassworks, it's a fantastic process. And thanks for all the work. Heavy lifting.
Okay. Yes, we can, right? And maybe we can look at more different examples. Kelsey mentioned Earth Day on April the 23rd. That's where we can actually meet. Thorsten will be there, Kristine will be there, Kelsey for sure will be there. Many of us will be there, so we actually can meet in person, which we usually don't do because we only meet on this Zoom. So that's a great opportunity to talk to each other. We have lots of presenters there, and you can dive with individuals more into it.
I'll let Jenny conclude, but before I do, I wanted to just tell people that the next third Thursday is going to be youth-led by Hannah Mayeli, and she's a climate activist in Kemble, Ontario, nearby Owen Sound, and she's going to it's going to be a pretty special episode. She's going to have some talks, organize some presenters, some panelists about climate adaptation versus climate mitigation, some basics, and we might get a lot of young people in the conversation, and this might be a great opportunity to get your neighbor and your friend in who might not be in the conversation already and be in the climate bubble.
Thanks everybody that came.
Thanks.
Yep.
Thanks, Jenny.
That's all. Yep.
Everybody.
Bye. See you in 4 weeks again.
My pleasure. Thank you for inviting Glassworks and for coordinating everything.